Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be hearing God as we come to Micah chapters 1 and 2. Micah chapter 1 starts off, this is the beginning of the book, the word of the Lord which came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Now, that's quite a bit to unpack. First of all, notice that this is in the days of the divided kingdom. You had Israel had divided from Judah. So Israel is the 10 tribes of Israel in the north, and then Judah in the south. And these kingdoms have been divided ever since the days of Solomon. When Solomon died, that's when the kingdom had divided. And notice, which he saw concerning Samaria. Samaria was now the capital city. It had not initially been the capital, but it had eventually become the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel. And then Jerusalem, Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah. As you mentioned the cities, they're actually representing the countries of which they are the capital. So when you say Jerusalem, you might mean the physical city, or you might mean the region over which Jerusalem governs. Just like if I say Washington has decided to do this, that, or the other, I'm actually speaking about all of the United States because its leadership is in the city of Washington, D.C. Now, here's our timeline, and we're going, from the top, that's earlier, down toward the bottom. Notice that Micah is living at the time when Israel is about to be taken, or is being taken, I should say, into captivity. We had had four different dynasties ruling, and then a number of independent kings, each who took power by way of assassination. And then that's going to come to a close in 721 BC. There will be no more kings of Israel. There will be no nation of Israel. The 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel will be taken away into captivity. The the kingdom of Judah is going to continue. Notice Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah at the bottom of the kings of Judah, and the same nation of Assyria that tried to take Israel, that did take Israel into captivity, will come up against Judah in the days of Hezekiah to take them as well, but they will fail. So I've given a little bit of a spoiler there, and we're going to read a prophecy about that here in the book of Micah. So Micah itself is going to be divided into three major oracles. We're only looking at chapters 1 and 2 right now, where we will see a judgment of idolatry. And then right at the end, the last few verses will be a promise of eventual regathering. Then as we come to chapter 3, we're going to see a second oracle. Again, there's going to be a judgment, this time against the rulers. And then that will be followed by an extensive promise of future glory. And then finally, chapters 6 and 7, where we see judgment against disloyalty, followed right at the end of the book by a promise of future restoration. So judgment and promise, judgment and promise, judgment and promise, that's the flow of thought that's going to be here in the book of Micah. Micah chapter 1 and verse 2, hear, O peoples, all of you. And then the next line, because this is poetry, even though it's we think of it as a prophetic book, you say it and then you say it again with different words. So, hear, O peoples, listen, O earth, and all it contains. It's really sort of the same, just a different way of saying the same thing. Let the Lord God be a witness against you. Now that's legal language. That's the language of a legal lawsuit. God is coming as a witness in a court of law, sort of you can imagine maybe a heavenly court of law. And God is not only the judge, but he is the chief witness against the accused, the Lord from his holy temple. For behold, the Lord is coming forth from his place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. So the picture is of God coming to bring condemnation and judgment, and he will execute that judgment. Verse 4, the mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will be split like wax before the fire, like water poured down a steep place. The language almost reminds you of a time when God had come down. Think of Mount Sinai, when Israel had come out of Egypt and they had come before Mount Sinai and they had received the law. That's the kind of language that is being used here. It's sort of a call to remember the past because God's going to do something like that again. Verse 5, all this for the rebellion of Jacob, notice the parallelism, and for the sins of the house of Israel. Jacob and Israel are just two different names for the same place. Rebellion and sins, two different terms for the same place. What is the rebellion of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? What is the high place of Judah? Is it not Jerusalem? Now, Samaria and Jerusalem aren't the same place, but they are both hearing about the judgment of God against them. And so, Samaria, Jerusalem, you say, well, which is this prophecy oriented toward? And the answer is it's both. In in the in the near future, it's about to be Samaria that's taken away into captivity. Later, much later, Jerusalem is going to suffer the same fate, and both are hearing words of judgment from God. Verse 6, for I will make Samaria, and we start with Samaria, we'll come back to Jerusalem. I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the open country, planting places for a vineyard. I will pour her stones down into the valley and lay bare her foundations. So he begins with Samaria, that's the capital of the northern kingdom. And just to say, sure enough, this took place in the year 721 BC. Verse 7, all her idols will be smashed, all of her earrings will be burned with fire, all of her images I will make desolate, for she collected them from a harlot's earnings. That's not necessarily talking about physical, although that might have been involved too. But we're speaking of spiritual harlotry, spiritual prostitution, and to the earnings of a harlot they will return. They're going to be actually delivered over into the hands of a spiritually destitute, a spiritual nation of prostitutes, that is the nation of Assyria. As I said, this took place 721 BC. You can actually go to the ruins of Samaria. They're actually located on somebody's private farm. You have to get permission to go there. The city has not been rebuilt. The site is still in ruins today. They've seen archaeological digs just for study's sake, but the city is still a heap even today. Now we get to verse 10, and we have this line, "Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all." And when you hear that line, you're supposed to recognize it from a much earlier song that had been composed by David. I have a portion of it here in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, although the song goes throughout most of the chapter. It starts off, your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places, how the mighty have fallen. And here's the line, tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. And David was singing that on the not anniversary, on the occasion of the death of Saul and Jonathan, how he describes Saul and Jonathan as the beauty of Israel, and they had been slain on Mount Gilboa in this fight against the Philistines. And so the call goes out: don't share the news in Gath, because they'll make it a time of rejoicing, and we're not rejoicing; we're mourning over his death. Now that line is used here in Micah. As we see, we're going to see a number of different cities here in Micah that's mentioned. Notice Gath, it's located a bit to the west. And as we move from the Mediterranean, you see the Mediterranean on the far left-hand side of our map. That's the coastal plain, the place where the Philistines had lived. As you move inland, you move up to what's called the Shephelah. The Shephelah is what they call the foothills. And you can stand on the coast and look to the east, and you can see the foothills in the distance. But then beyond the foothills, you'll see the mountain region. And you can also, Israel's so small that you can stand on the coast and you can see the Shephelah fairly close, and then the mountains beyond them, because the mountains are higher. The foothills lead up to the mountains. And we're going to see a number of cities. Notice Gath is one of those, but we're going to see Marashah and Lachish and Moresheth Gath, Adullam, Jerusalem. All of these will be mentioned. I put a few extras just to get your bearings. But these cities are mostly going to be in the Shephelah, that intermediate region that is part of the land of Judah. Now, Judah's not that big of a place, you know. Remember, the northern kingdom has been taken away into captivity. The southern kingdom remains, and it's quite small. And so our verse says, "Tell it not in Gath, weep not at all." Now, when it says "tell it not in Gath," the Hebrew "begath al tagidu," and it's a little bit of a pun. Notice with Gath and tagidu, that G sound. Um, it's a little bit of a rhyme. And you say, well, this is poetry, isn't it? But Hebrew poetry almost never rhymes except when it is by way of a pun, sort of a verbal joke. And this is no laughing matter, but we're going to have not just here, but throughout these next few verses, we're going to see, for about 4 or 5 verses, we're going to see a whole series of puns. And it begins with this phrase, "Tell it not in Gath." Now that was borrowed from an earlier song, so that's almost coincidental. And I would take it as such were it not for the verses that follow. So notice you've got Begath, "Tell it not in Gath," and Tegidu. It sort of sounds a little bit alike. Next, you have at Beth Le'afra. Beth Le'afra, Beth is the word for house, and Le'afra, house of dust. He goes on, "At Beth Le'afra, roll yourself in afer, in dust." Verse 11, "Go on your way, inhabitant of Saphir, in shameful nakedness." Now, Saphir, that means beauty. That's the name. That's what the name of the town meant. But notice, in shameful nakedness. That's a little bit unusual that beauty would be. Next, we have the inhabitant of Za'an. I'm sorry, Za'anan. Got to get that extra vowel in. Um, the inhabitant of Za'anan does not escape. Lo yatsa. Now notice the sound Za'anan and lo atsa, that sort of sound. Again, this is a little bit of a pun, um, where you've got the term escape that sounds a little bit like the inhabitant of Za'an, Za'anan. He continues then the lamentation of Beth Ezel, and Beth Ezel, Beth is the word for house, Ezel is to join. Um, he will take from you its support. So you remember what makes it what holds the house up. The supports of a house are joined together. You take that away, and the house of joining becomes a house of falling apart. Remember how a house divided itself cannot stand, and that's the idea here. Verse 12, for the inhabitant of Ma'aroth, I'm sorry, Maroth, and the term here, Maroth, Mara is the word for bitter, so this is the inhabitant of bitterness, becomes weak, waiting for good, because a calamity, and the word for calamity is ra, and it can ra can refer to actually it can refer to moral evil, but it can just refer to a bad thing like a hurricane or an earthquake, just something bad that takes place. Hence a calamity, because a ra has come down, and here to come down is yarad. So ra and yarad, you can just hear the word association. Doesn't have the same meaning, but it has the same sound, and it has come down to the Lord, and then to the gate of Jerusalem, Yeshar Yerushalayim, and you can hear that sha sound in both terms. So it again, there's a little bit of a rhyme that's taking place, and the point is that these bad things are happening in the land. God is bringing calamity to the very gates of Jerusalem. Verse 13, we continue, harness the chariot to the team of horses, to La Rakesh, that's the team of horses, O inhabitants of Lachish. And again, you can hear the where those two terms sound alike. the team of horses, and Lachish. Uh, she was the beginning of sin to the daughters of Zion, uh, La Bath Zion. We say Zion, they say Zion. Because in you were found, and that phrase, ki bak nimtsu, so notice the Zion and tsu, that TS sound, very distinctive in Hebrew, the rebellious acts of Israel. And so these are all calls for judgment. We're not done yet. Verse 14, therefore, he says, you will give parting gifts on behalf of Morsheth Gath. Notice the parting gifts on behalf of Morsheth Gath. Now, they don't sound alike here, but Morsheth is the idea of possession. So it's the possession of Gath, and a possession is, when you get a gift, you're getting a possession. So it's a wordplay in meaning, not in sound this time. And then the houses of Akzib will become a Akzab. And here you do have the rhyming of a pun. So it sounds like, the word for deception. The house of Akzib will become an Akzab, a deception to the kings of Israel. We get down to verse 15. Moreover, I will bring on you the one who takes possession. Here we've got Harosheth, and then O inhabitant of Marashah. And again, you that Russia, you have that same sound. The glory of Israel will enter Adullam. Now, Longman put this very, very loose translation together, but I think he did a delightful job. I'm going to give you my own version, which will be a lot less germane. But what he's doing, he's changing the names of the place. He keeps Jerusalem there, but all the others, he changes the names to what it sounds like. But he's trying to capture the flow and the rhyming puns that are used. So he says, tell it not in Tellington, wail not in wailing. Dust manor will eat dirt. Dressy town will flee naked. Safehold will not save. All Chester's walls are down. A bitter dose drinks Bitterton. Toward Jerusalem, city of peace, the Lord sends war. Harness the war steeds, O men of Barsted. Zion's beginning of sinning equal to Israel's crime. To farewell, alas, farewell, for trapped Israel's kings. A very loose translation, but he's trying to get the idea of the rhyming and the word plays that take place. Now, I'm going to give you my own version. My own version is centered, I really changed the name, so it's not, I wouldn't call it a translation at all. I would call it a rendition applying it to the cities of South Florida. Here's my own version. As I said, it's not literal. It's not really a translation. What I'm doing is trying to capture the same sorts of word plays and apply it to the cities of South Florida. So if you're not from South Florida, I apologize. Bear with me. Dade is browbeaten by Brow, and notice the Broward is browbeaten by Broward County. But the wise avoid Miami's vices. Boca Raton has closed its mouth. You have to speak a little Spanish to get the point there. Toward those that travel on I-95 South. With the coming of day in Del Rey, the sun will set in Sunrise. As the gate is locked in Margate, the lights are out in Lighthouse Point, and the deer have fled the field of Deerfield Beach. Hollywood would be holy if Davy were not so lazy. Pompano is full of pomp as Wilton minds its manners. Now, I apologize. I'm not trying to be mean to those cities. I actually live in one of those and work in another one. But I'm just trying to see you uh, make an image of the wordplay. We come to chapter 2 and verse 1, and we leave all of those puns behind. Instead, we're going to get I'm going to say, in a sense, instead we're going to get more serious. And not to say that wasn't serious before, but puns are a little bit lighthearted. So woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil. And that's two ways of saying the same thing. But notice, they don't just scheme iniquity, they work out evil on their beds. and sort of captured that. There's a reason I think he mentioned that. When morning comes, they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. So they're up all night thinking about evil, and then they get up, and instead of those thoughts being banished, they actually put those things into practice. Verse 2, they covet fields and then seize them, and houses and take them away. They rob a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Now, as you see this description of somebody in bed thinking and then coveting and robbing, of whom does this remind you? It's supposed to remind you of something. And indeed, when we get to the end of the book of Micah, there's going to be a big hint dropped. Hey, remember that? He's going to be mentioned by name. Um, when we get to Micah chapter 6 and verse 16, we'll see a reference to the statutes of Omri, and all the works of the house of Ahab are observed, and in their devices you walk. So notice that the people of Judah and Israel are going to be likened to Omri, but especially to Ahab. And remember how Ahab coveted someone's vineyard, somebody's field, and and just was in bed over it, and coveting and upset. And then his wife Jezebel sort of takes control. And between the two of them, they robbed the man, his house, and his inheritance, put him to death. But that sin of Ahab was now being repeated in countless other examples. Verse 3, thus says the Lord, behold, I am planting, the Hebrew choshev, planning against this family a calamity. Remember, Ra'ah is a calamity. And back in verse 1, I didn't give you the Hebrew then, but when he said, woe to those who scheme, that's that same choshev, the scheming, planning, to those who work out evil. In that case, it was moral evil, Ra, on their beds. So those terms are repeated, and God says, "Look, you schemed evil. You schemed. You planned evil. I'm scheming. I'm planning. It's not scheming in a bad sense, but I'm planning a judgment, a calamity from which you cannot remove your necks, and you will not walk haughtily as you have been, for it will be an evil time." We get down to verse 8, and I'm skipping over some verses. Recently, my people have arisen as an enemy. You strip the robe off the garment from unsuspecting passersby, from those returned from war. We would talk about how you treat your veterans, and instead of supporting them, you rob them. That's terrible. Verse 9: the women of my people you evict, presumably, maybe in the context of war, perhaps those who were widows, who are robbed, who are evicted, each one from her pleasant house, from her children. You take my splendor forever. You're stealing those who are already down, those who are already out. You're kicking them out, removing them from their homes, taking all sorts of unfair advantage against them. So you strip the robe, you evict, and these are things that they were doing. And remember, they were probably doing this according to legal customs. It wasn't thought of as evil. I'm just a landlord kicking out the people that couldn't pay. But it was seen as an evil from God because they were persecuting the poor. Now we come down to verse 12. And verse 12, remember we said that we're going to see judgment and then hope. And here's the hope. It's only a few verses. Verse 12, I will surely assemble all of you, Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. Jacob and Israel saying the same thing, assembling and gathering, it's the same thing. I will put them together like sheep in the fold, like a flock in the midst of its pasture. They will be noisy with none. Verse 13, the breaker goes up before them. They break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. So their king goes on before them, and the Lord is at their head. That the king, notice, the Lord is viewed as a shepherd, and it reminds us of the words of the final king of Israel, the words of King Jesus, who said, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me, even as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Jesus is the good shepherd. He is king, yes, but he's also the good shepherd who gave his life for the king. He's the king who died for his kingdom, so that if we trust in him, we become part of his sheep, we become part of his fold, and we live with him forever. And that means the promise that is given here at the end of Micah chapter 2, it's given to us as well. We can apply this promise for us because he will gather us to himself if we are his sheep, if we have trusted in him as our Lord and Savior.